It was a scene not witnessed on the streets of Dublin for well over a decade. Men and women in berets, sunglasses, scarves and Green Army-style clothing. But what the cameras did not capture was the 3 gunshots fired into the air by a person or persons unknown as the coffin of Alan Ryan began the journey to the church in Donaghmede. This is the man whose murder has sparked such strong feelings, 31-year-old Alan Ryan from Grange Abbey Drive in Donaghmede. He was shot multiple times in broad daylight last week. The murder was brutal and clinical. The masked gunman shot Alan Ryan a number of times before moving in closer and shooting him again, as this friend and witness outlined on radio today.
Alan probably didn't know what had happened. I think Alan was killed very quickly. He was shot a large number of times, yeah. The fella made sure that he'd killed Alan, you know.
It is a unique event in itself, this killing, because never, as far as I can remember, have organised crime, non-political organised crime, attacked any Republican paramilitary group with such ferocity.
Just months after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and while still a teenager, Alan Ryan was arrested in Donaghmede in possession of a loaded gun. The following year, while on bail, he was one of 10 people arrested at a real IRA training camp in Stamullen in County Meath. He served a total of 7 years for both offences. Upon his release from prison, he rose to the top of the real IRA in Dublin. At the time of his murder, he was on bail awaiting trial for allegedly...
Masked gunmen storm a crowded Dublin hotel. Bullets shatter the air, and in seconds, one man lies dead, a dissident Republican caught in the middle of a war far bigger than himself. His name will echo through headlines, his death sparking questions no one dares answer out loud. Was he a victim of vengeance, or a conspirator silenced by his own allies? Tonight, we peel back the layers of betrayal, power, and bloodshed that turned Dublin into a battlefield. And as the bodies fell, one truth became terrifyingly clear. No one in this city was safe. This is the story of how a dissident Republican died in the Dublin gang war. Dublin, a city of cobblestones, pubs, and centuries of history, was also a place where shadows moved quietly and loyalties could decide whether a man lived or died. On the surface, life carried on with its rhythm. Families gathering for Sunday dinners, children rushing to school, lovers arguing on late buses. But beneath it, another rhythm pulsed, one that belonged to criminals who had turned neighborhoods into battle zones. The story begins in that uneasy balance, where ordinary citizens tried to look away while knowing violence was never far from their doorsteps. The death that would capture headlines and grip the country was not random. It was rooted in rivalries so deep they shaped the air of Dublin's streets. To understand what came next, we must stand in that moment, when danger wasn't whispered but felt in every corner shop and every darkened lane. At the center of this world were men whose names carried weight and fear, their reputations bigger than the houses they lived in or the cars they drove. On one side stood families who had carved their fortunes from smuggling and trafficking, blending into society while running empires no government could easily touch. On the other side, figures who were once tied to politics and paramilitary ideals had begun to blur lines, stepping into organized crime with the same discipline and ruthlessness. These were not faceless gangs but networks built on blood ties, betrayals, and oaths that could be broken with a single phone call. It was here that the man at the center of our story found himself, known by some as a dissident Republican, by others as a trusted ally, and by enemies as someone who had to be silenced. The time and place mattered as much as the people, because Dublin in those years was like a city carrying two faces, one smiling for tourists and cameras, the other bruised and raw, hidden away in neighborhoods most people avoided after dark. Pubs that once rang with laughter became meeting grounds where whispers turned into plans, where a man's fate could be sealed before his pint was even finished. Boxing matches, family weddings, funerals, each of these ordinary gatherings carried a second purpose, a stage where alliances were confirmed or shattered. The streets were not just concrete and brick. They were chessboards, and every move was calculated with the knowledge that one wrong step meant death. This was the setting where our story unfolded, a world where the rules were written not by laws, but by those ruthless enough to enforce them. The victim, long before his name appeared in bold type across newspapers, lived in this tension, his life a blend of ideology and survival. To some, He represented a strand of republicanism that refused to die, a thread of defiance carried from one generation to the next. To others, he was no more than a man of convenience, someone whose skills and connections could be used for purposes far from politics. He moved in circles where loyalty was currency, but loyalty could be bought, sold, or stolen in the blink of an eye. That dual identity, part political, part criminal, placed him in the crosshairs of forces larger than he could ever control. As we step into his story, what becomes clear is that nothing about this death was simple. It was not a random act, nor a crime that could be understood without peeling back the layers of secrecy surrounding it. Dublin was a city waiting for the next gunshot, the next funeral, the next headline that would remind everyone of how fragile peace really was. And for one dissident Republican, the price of walking those streets would prove fatal, setting in motion a chain of events that would scar the city for years to come. It is here, in this charged atmosphere of fear and inevitability, that the story truly begins. Whispers spread faster than the truth in Dublin's underworld, and once suspicion touched a man's name, it rarely let go. The killing of one figure had opened a door that could not be closed, and in the quiet corners of the city, people speculated about who would be next. Friends looked over their shoulders, mothers begged their sons not to linger outside too long, and even the simple act of answering a knock at the door carried a sense of dread. Alliances were shifting like sand, and in that shifting, men who were once untouchable suddenly seemed vulnerable. It was in this unsettled climate that the lines between dissident ideals and organized crime began to blur, making it harder to know where politics ended and blood money began. The man whose life hung in the balance had not chosen an easy path, and those who knew him understood that. He was neither a bystander nor a stranger to the world he moved in, yet his role was always surrounded by shadows. Was he trusted, or merely tolerated until his usefulness ran out? Each answer depended on who you asked, and in those contradictions lay the seeds of his downfall. His presence in certain company, his voice in certain conversations, all became reasons for others to question his loyalty, and in that questioning, danger grew. In pubs that doubled as meeting grounds, his name surfaced in ways that were not flattering. Some accused him of knowing too much, of being too close to men who had orchestrated a bold attack that humiliated their rivals. Others painted him as reckless, someone whose movements drew attention at a time when secrecy was everything. Still others claimed he was playing both sides, a dangerous game in a city where betrayal was punished with bullets. Whether those claims were true or not mattered little. Once the rumor took root, it was enough to sign a death warrant. The tension did not only live in the whispers of criminals. It reached into ordinary homes where people tried to shield their children from the violence outside. Families whispered about gunmen who wore masks and vanished into the night, about cars set ablaze to cover tracks, about the endless funerals that came one after another. In these neighborhoods, children grew up learning to recognize the sound of gunfire the way others learned to recognize songs on the radio. Fear became routine, and trust was a rare currency few could afford to spend. Against this backdrop, the man at the center of our story carried a target he could not remove, no matter how carefully he walked. It was only a matter of time before speculation hardened into certainty. Before the questions surrounding him turned into accusations no one spoke aloud but everyone believed. The city braced itself, knowing that when the next act of violence came, it would not be small, and it would not be hidden. Dublin was not just watching. It was waiting, caught between dread and inevitability. And for one dissident Republican, each passing day felt like the pull of a clock winding closer to zero, each shadow longer, each silence louder. The tension was no longer rising. It was pressing down, suffocating, and ready to explode. The night everything shifted was not announced with fanfare, but with the sudden silence that follows when danger steps into a room. In a small Dublin pub, laughter turned to panic as masked men pushed through the doors, their movements fast, precise, and merciless. They did not hesitate. They did not speak. They only raised their weapons and filled the air with noise that left no space for doubt. In seconds, the man whose name had lived in whispers was struck down, his body collapsing among chairs and spilled drinks. The chaos that followed, the screams, the scrambling feet, the desperate cries for help, was the sound of a city realizing that the feud had reached a point from which there was no return. What made this killing different was not only the brutality, but the certainty behind it. There was no warning, no veiled threat, no second chance for explanations or negotiations. It was a message written in bullets, a declaration that whatever questions lingered about loyalty or betrayal no longer mattered. The gunmen did not just erase a life, they erased the possibility of redemption, silencing a man whose very existence had become a liability. In that act, a feud that had been simmering turned into an inferno, and the city itself became the stage for violence too brazen to ignore. The shockwave stretched far beyond the walls of that pub. Families who had hoped the tension might pass now realized that it would only grow worse, because this was no longer about revenge alone. It was about control, dominance, and fear. Each new killing hardened the lines between factions, and those caught in the middle understood that survival depended less on innocence and more on being invisible. For the police, the crime scenes piling up became evidence of a war they could not contain, a battle fought in alleys and living rooms as much as in headlines. The killing had marked a turning point, and no authority seemed strong enough to stop what would come next. For those closest to him, grief carried a cruel mixture of sorrow and inevitability. They had feared this outcome, even as they prayed for another path, but deep down they knew the city would not allow him to walk away untouched. His death became another link in a chain of violence, one that would drag countless others into its grip. And as the sun rose the next morning, Dublin woke to yet another reminder that no one could predict who would be next. The turning point had arrived, not with answers, but with a haunting certainty that the story was far from finished. In the days after the gunfire faded, Dublin stood in a state of uneasy mourning, torn between shock and grim acceptance. Another life had been taken, another name added to a list that seemed to grow longer with each passing month. Police tape stretched across the entrance of the pub where the killing had unfolded, but even as investigators marked evidence and collected fragments of bullets, the people watching from behind the cordon already knew justice would be slow, fragile, and uncertain. The streets carried the weight of silence, a silence broken only by the low hum of fear that followed everyone home. The city was not only grieving, it was bracing for what would inevitably come next. Trials did follow, long and complicated, with suspects brought before courts that carried more security than many prisons. Witnesses stepped forward, some trembling as they spoke of what they saw, others refusing to say a word out of fear for their families. Years would pass before convictions were secured, and even then the sense of closure was fragile at best. The families of victims wept outside courthouses, holding photographs of their loved ones, trying to give shape to grief that could not be measured. For them, no verdict could balance the scales because the people they lost would never return. The feud did not end with a single arrest or acquittal. Instead, it lived on, reshaping Dublin's underworld and stretching its influence far beyond Ireland. International headlines followed the story, framing it as a battle between cartels and clans, between power and vengeance. Law enforcement agencies across Europe began to link drug networks and smuggling routes back to the same names. Proof that this was not just a local war but part of something larger and far more dangerous. Yet even as governments tightened their grip, the families left behind still faced the same unbearable reality. Empty chairs at dinner tables, birthdays marked by candles that would never be blown out. The aftermath was not just political or criminal. It was deeply personal. And for those who lived in the neighborhoods where the blood was spilled, the fear did not leave with the last echo of a gavel. Mothers still warned their sons not to be seen in the wrong place. Fathers walked their children home under streetlights that felt too dim to be safe, and young people grew up with stories of gangland killings as familiar as family legends. Dublin carried the scars of the violence, etched into both memory and reputation, shaping how the world looked at the city and how its people looked at one another. It was not simply a feud, it was a wound that healed slowly, if at all, leaving behind a reminder that peace could be shattered with the pull of a trigger. The death of one dissident Republican became more than a headline. It became a symbol of how fragile the line is between ideology and survival, between crime and consequence. His story, though cut short, opened a window into a conflict that consumed not only its players, but also the streets they walked and the families who loved them. The aftermath carried no neat conclusion, no final chapter tied with justice or redemption. It lingered in the unanswered questions, in the empty spaces, in the truth that Dublin had been changed forever. And as time moved on, the echoes of that night reminded everyone that some wars never truly end. They only fade into the background, waiting for the next name, the next shot, the next silence. What do you believe really happened in Dublin's gang war? Was the man who died that night simply a victim caught in a storm he couldn't control, or was he silenced because he knew too much? The truth remains tangled in secrecy, and every theory leaves behind questions that refuse to rest. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in keeping these stories alive. If this story gripped you, make sure to subscribe for more untold true crime cases, and don't forget to like and share this video so others can join the conversation. The feud may have ended for some, but for those left behind, the scars remain, and so do the questions.